Good morning. I'm just going to say a few words about prohibition, and then maybe we can have a discussion about it. It's a very big subject, obviously. I'm not just talking about prohibition of alcohol, which is what people tend to think of in the 1920s America, but also the war on drugs, which has been going on for around about 100 years now. Depends at what point you start it, but I would say probably 100 years this year, in fact. Tobacco, and also to some extent different types of food which are under attack. The prohibition in simple economic terms is simply curtailing supply without curtailing demand. That's really all it is. As a result of that, as you would expect, the price goes up. But the supply doesn't dry out entirely. It depends on what the product is, what the demand is, and the level of enforcement that's possible, but the supply will never dry up entirely. All that happens is that the suppliers are no longer able to appeal to contract law to settle their disputes, and so they tend to resort to other methods, particularly violence, to do so. What it means for the consumer is that they no longer have any regulatory framework for a product to make sure that it's safe, or as safe as it can be. And so you have a triple whammy of problems, really: the price going up, of rising crime as a result of the illicit trade, and the product itself becoming more hazardous. And you can see that it becomes more hazardous usually because the product is adapted to suit the needs of the supplier rather than the customer. And so in 1920s America, for example, you had people who were mainly drinking beer shifting to whiskey, and very strong whiskey, or gin or rum, sometimes up to 80% proof, because it was easier for the smugglers to transport it that way, and it was more compact, and so it was better business. You see the same thing with heroin now, where 100 years ago, people, if they took opiates, they would generally smoke opium or possibly take morphine in some instances. But once opium smoking was banned, people took heroin because that's what was out there, because again, it's more compact, it's more concentrated, makes more money for the supplier. Prohibitionists themselves, it's a very interesting, difficult question to say, why are some people prohibitionists? I would tend to say that the one abiding characteristic of them is that they tend to be idealists, and they tend to have an excessive faith in the power of law to change human behaviour. They tend to have, not always, but they very often tend to have very little empathy with the person who's taking the drug or the drink or whatever it may be. Certainly they can't understand the appeal of it themselves. And seeing their worth in the product themselves, they come to believe that people only consume the product because they're under some delusion, or because they're being manipulated by advertisers, or because it's too widely available or too cheap. They struggle to come to terms with the idea that people might take drugs or drink or smoke because they actually like doing so. I'm just going to give 5 quick steps to how to be a prohibitionist, basically 5 tactics that have been used over many, many years and are still used today. I would argue, you see, that there's various levels of prohibition. I'm not obviously going to say that people are trying to prohibit food or even alcohol. Typically, these idealists begin from a temperance point of view, which is to say moderation. Temperance literally just means moderation. And they perhaps go for availability of a product, so they want to have fewer licenses for pubs, for example, or they want price to go up, which is where the taxation comes in, or they want advertising banned because they believe that this is what's actually causing the demand. So in a way, they are trying to curtail the demand rather than just the supply. But that very quickly soon moves on to a prohibitionist point of view, because if something is so bad that we can't advertise it, that it has to be limited and hidden away, then why is it available at all, goes the cry. And you'll very quickly see people throughout the ages who start off with a point of view of moderation, but move on to prohibition. It's also much neater, politically, it's much neater to demand a complete abolition of something, rather than saying, well, we think you should only drink 2 or 3 units a day, or whatever it may be. So step 1, I would say, is creating your evidence. And I say create rather than gather together, because often it's simply a matter of making it up. In the late 19th century, the temperance movement very slowly moved towards prohibition. It took many, many decades, starting really in the, it depends again, 1830s, but certainly the 1870s, a real movement for prohibition began. And mainly led by women, Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they realised that they couldn't vote themselves and that most people drank. It was going to be very difficult to bring in prohibition. So they started with the children, and they managed to get every textbook, every biology textbook in America to dedicate a very significant section to what they called scientific temperance instruction, which wasn't scientific and not particularly instructive. But the core points of scientific temperance instruction were that alcohol's instantly addictive, it doesn't have any medicinal benefits, it's toxic in any quantity and can kill instantly, and it leads to racial degeneracy, effectively, and genetic deformities and so on. As were a lot of these things, there was a kernel of truth in some of these claims. In others, it was just simply lies and anecdotes and Chinese whispers. And you see a similar kind of thing today, particularly with the idea that there's no safe level of products. The idea that something is toxic in its entirety was crucial to the prohibitionists with alcohol, because it was widely accepted, quite rightly, that a little of what you fancy does you no harm, and doctors were prescribing alcohol on quite a large scale because they had so little else to prescribe. But this was a very deliberate attempt to mould minds. The woman who was in charge of the Scientific Temperance Instruction Board said that the day is surely coming when the schoolhouses all over the land the day is surely coming when from the schoolhouses all over the land will come trained haters of alcohol to pour a whole Niagara of ballads upon the saloon. This was a very long-term plan, took 30 or 40 years, but by the time Prohibition came in, most people, certainly everybody under the age of 40, had grown up believing that alcohol was literally a poison in any form and could turn your blood to water and your heart to fat, and so on. Step 2 is to attack the industry. This is very important because it depersonalises a conflict which is essentially between neighbours and friends. Some people want to drink, for example, other people may be teetotal. We can live quite happily together on that basis until people start interfering. But if you bring the industry into it, then you can portray it as being a battle between the people and profits. And people are naturally cynical about the vested interest of business. And you see this all the time now in all sorts of areas. In the 1910s, early part of the 20th century in America, it was, of course, the liquor trust, as it was called. It was never actually particularly strong, the liquor trust. They were constantly infighting because it was two industries, beer and liquor. And they're actually incredibly incompetent and could have stopped Prohibition if they managed to get their act together, but they never did. Somebody wrote a couple of years into Prohibition. He was an opponent of Prohibition, but he remembered back to the campaigning prior to the law coming in, and he said throughout the entire agitation it was the invariable habit of Prohibition advocates to stigmatise the anti-Prohibition forces as representing nothing but the liquor interests. The fight was presented in the light of a struggle between those who wished to coin money out of the degradation of their fellow creatures and those who sought to save mankind from perdition. That the millions of people who enjoyed drinking, to whom it was a cherished source of refreshment, recuperation and sociability, had any stake in the matter, the agitators never for a moment acknowledged. If a man stood out against Prohibition, he was not the champion of the millions who enjoyed drink, but the servant of the interests who sold drink. And again, you see this a lot, particularly the last 5 or 10 years. Big tobacco, big oil would probably be the most often cited ones. Big food, I'm seeing more and more in the newspapers. The point of putting a big there is to make it look like a David and Goliath contest. Often, actually, the balance of power in terms of political influence and often in terms of money is the other way around. But this David-Goliath fantasy makes the Prohibitionist feel more heroic and makes the successes seem more impressive. Step 3 is to create panic. This is absolutely critical. There's a large literature about moral entrepreneurs and social deviants in sociology, which is, goes back to the 1960s and is very interesting. Essentially, for a moral panic, you need to have your deviants and you need to have your moral entrepreneurs. The deviants can come from any strata of society. Generally, it's best to pick a group of people who are already unpopular. In the late 19th, 20th century, the moral panics tended to be based around racial discrimination, with alcohol the southern states of America went dry, largely because there was such a panic about black people drinking and causing carnage, and in particular raping white women. We can't say this never happened. Okay? There is certainly one famous documented case of it happening. But what happens with moral panics is you get one incident, much exaggerated, and it's made out to be an epidemic, which is going on all the time, and something must be done to stop it. From that slur came a very, very similar slur, which basically accused black people in the southern states of raping white women under the influence of cocaine 10 years later. The stories were directly copied from the alcohol prohibitionists. And with opium, you also had a panic about the Chinese, who were persecuted terribly in the late 19th century in America, particularly in California, because the unions and labourers believed they were taking their jobs and all this kind of stuff. But there was this fear of white people being lured into, particularly young white women being lured into the opium dens by the Chinamen. And the idea of the sinister Chinaman is a running theme in quite a lot of literature of that time. It's not always racial, and it's particularly not racial these days because racism, unfortunately, has largely gone out of favour. But you do see a similar thing with the youth gone wild aspect. You see this with the ecstasy panic in the 1980s and 1990s, with designer drugs today. With binge drinking to a large extent, and in particular alcohol pops. It's about young people doing something that the previous generation hadn't done, that they don't understand and they think must be much worse than what they were doing themselves. And there's also a class aspect to it as well. With the ongoing debate about alcohol and minimum pricing today, if you see a story about binge drinking, it will always refer to very strong lager or extra strong cider is what they're particularly trying to clamp down on. If you see a positive story about the health benefits of alcohol, it will always be a glass of wine. There's a clear class divide there, as there has always been. There's this idea that working class people now have too much money, and we need to increase prices of the things we don't want to take to dissuade them. And even in the 1910s, once they banned opium, young white people in the urban cities, New York in particular, they began taking heroin, and there was a huge moral panic about heroin use then. Two more steps, and these two apply particularly to today. And both of them are very important to campaigners because they help overcome the traditional liberal hurdle, which is that people should be allowed to do whatever they want to do so long as it doesn't hurt other people, effectively, the John Stuart Mill harm principle. One of them is to say, let's think of the children, because we have different rules for children. We do accept that children need to be treated differently and should not be allowed access to certain products. And when people talk about thinking of the children, you can be sure 9 times out of 10 that some legislation is on the cards that will restrict the liberties of adults. And you see this plain packaging, as Sam was mentioned, junk food advertising, was supposed to be banned a couple of years ago during children's programs. Then shock horror, it turns out that children actually watch some other programs as well. Therefore, we need to ban it on the X Factor and EastEnders because some children might be watching. And ultimately, it becomes a blanket ban and a blanket sponsorship ban because children generally see the same things as adults as they walk through this world, and there's no safe level of exposure to advertising. And finally, and again, this is an idea that tries to overcome this hurdle of personal liberty. You tell the people who aren't consuming the product that other people's consumption is adversely affecting them, that they're having their pockets pinched effectively by irresponsible binge drinkers or by smokers who are carelessly dying too young and so on. And I've got a paper coming out with the Adam Smith Institute in early May, which looks at this idea of, are the sinners costing the saints a lot of money? You see enormous figures, many billions of pounds of how much smokers are supposed to cost society, how much drinkers, how much the obese is supposed to cost society. These are all essentially lies because they are not what people believe them to be. They include many costs which are private to the individual. So, for example, every penny spent on cigarettes is included as a cost to society, even though that cost is clearly being paid by the smoker. It makes no sense to make cigarettes more expensive to make them pay more. There are many intangible costs, such as we will estimate that a human year of life is worth $100,000, and then we'll multiply that by the number of years that are lost through these dirty habits, and then claim that's a cost to society. They are a cost to society. Nearly all of them are personal costs, many of them are hypothetical. And finally, the studies don't include the benefits. There are savings of people dying younger, which nobody wants to be so indelicate as to mention, but they do exist. And there are also personal benefits that people receive from consuming the products, which are never brought into the equation, even though many intangible and very tenuous costs are. So there are 5 of many tips that prohibitionists can pick up on, and tactics that are used, and things to perhaps look out for. And at that point I will stop and go to the floor.